Probably the most boring book in the Bible. Everything that most people hate about religion and about the Bible can be found in the book of Leviticus.
So today we want to talk about the book of Leviticus, or most people will know it as the third book of Moses. So it's part of the Old Testament, and it's a book which is normally seen as extremely boring. And I know a lot of people who once tried to read the Bible from the beginning until the end, and they made good progress through the first book of Moses. There is still some progress in the second book of Moses because it's at least some interesting stories in it. But when it comes to the third book of Moses, to Leviticus, they normally gave up.
There's a famous quote that many an attempt to read the Bible in a year have been shipwrecked on the shores of Leviticus, just because it can be hard to read. So.
But if you look a little bit deeper, I think Leviticus is a fascinating book which opens a lot of venues into the biblical world.
The word Leviticus comes from the word Levite. The word Levite comes from Levi, and Levi was one of the 12 children who formed the 12 tribes. The other 11 tribes each had a piece of land they could farm. The Levites, the children of Levi, they were to be the ones who looked after the temple. They were to be the ones that looked after sacrifice. And here was a book that was about sacrifice, about the priesthood, about the things that only the priesthood could do and couldn't do. And so this became their book, the book of Leviticus.
First of all, one of the most famous verses in the Bible can be found in Leviticus, and most people are not aware that this is actually found in Leviticus and actually found in the Old Testament, because they think this is a typical New Testament verse, namely love your neighbor as yourself, as a command of God. This is one of the center verses in Leviticus, but it's part of a longer section which is called the Holiness Code. So it describes a behavior which is necessary in a way to live a life as the people of God.
10 chapters about how to get a pleasing odor to rise up from a sacrifice before God. You get details about how to cut out livers, how to take the fat off kidneys, who can and cannot offer the sacrifice. So 10 chapters of how to offer a burnt offering so that the odor is pleasing to the Lord. It's slightly repetitious.
In Leviticus 16, there's the Day of Atonement, which is very important to Jewish people nowadays. And the outstanding thing about the Day of Atonement is that after making 4 kinds of sacrifice, the final sort was called the scapegoat, where symbolically the priest would rest his hand on the head of the goat, representing all the evils that people wanted to get rid of, and then the goat was sent off into the wilderness, or sometimes it was pushed over a precipice. It represented getting rid of all that's unpleasant and evil, and it took place once a year to give one a fresh start, as it were. So that when people say that somebody is a scapegoat for some problem that they really want to vent their anger on, it derives from that, it comes from that.
If you can put up with the boringness of it, it talks about the sin of the wealthy man, the sin of the poor man, and even the sin of the king. So 2 things flow from that. Everyone in Israel was equal before God, from the king to the poorest person. Before God, they all had to acknowledge they could sin, and they all had to then go through the appropriate sacrifice. And that's a great leveler.
Traditionally, it's ascribed to Moses. It probably came to its final form in the 5th and 6th centuries BC.
The scholarly opinion, with good reasons, makes clear that the book of Leviticus is a collection which contains a lot of material from covering many centuries.
The book was written after the intelligentsia came back from Babylon. So it was written about 500 BC. It was written by the priestly group in Jerusalem. And curiously enough, they're now pretending that this was given to them back at the time before they'd even settled in Palestine, before they ever had a temple. It's when they're out in a tent in the desert. but actually it's written after they had seen the great temples of Babylon. So for instance, there's Babylonian and Zoroastrian influences in the book of Leviticus.
In a way, it's mainly lists and rules, and there's hardly any story in the whole book.
Probably also what makes Leviticus difficult to read compared to with like Genesis or Exodus or many of the other books is there's not a lot of narrative. So you don't have really cool stories like in Judges where Ehud takes a little sword and he stabs a king in the gut, and the fat from his gut covers up the sword. Instead, in Leviticus, you have instructions and then a very brief narrative talking about the installation of the priests and actually the death of two of the priests because of an offering of unauthorized fire.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is one passage that is always used when fundamentalist Christians want to beat up on gays, and that is chapter 18, verse 22. No man is to lie with another man as with a woman. And whenever I hear that verse, I'm always anxious to say to the Christians who hold it, it says, it's written in the Bible. Okay, well, it's written in the book of Leviticus, but there's 2 chapters on how to deal with skin diseases. Are you going to use those 2 chapters rather than go to the Queen's Medical Centre just down the road here? There's 2 chapters on dealing with corpses. Are you going to do that rather than ring the undertaker? So, you know, people say, well, maybe that verse shouldn't be there. Well, you take the rough with the smooth reading any document that's 2,500 years old.
It seems kind of arbitrary when you read it as well. It talks about what animals they can eat, what animals they can't eat. You can't eat things that, you can eat fish, but you can't eat things that crawl on the ground out of the ocean. You can't eat creepy crawly things. You can't eat vultures, rock badgers. You can't eat pigs because of the way their foot is designed.
All the things that swarm upon the earth are an abomination. They shall not be eaten.
It just seems kind of arbitrary, and some people will say today, oh, well, that's because, you know, we discovered that these animals really aren't actually good for us, and so it was a way of actually unknowingly that the Israelites received things that were good for their health. And that is one argument. What seems more interesting within the structure of Leviticus itself is that God is described as really laying out boundaries.
Even if we don't understand the precise reasons behind all these regulations and don't know why it's a problem to eat lizards or whatever kind of animals, the idea is be separated, be special, and follow my commandments, and following the commandments makes you holy.